everybody, I am the Indoor Adventurer, and today we are going to be talking about the Sandbox as a style of gameplay for Dungeons & Dragons, and what that means for the outcome of your adventuring parties. Will they become champions of the realm, or bloodthirsty murder hobos who have no real anchors in the world they exist in? Technopedia defines a sandbox game as a style of game in which minimal character limitations are placed on the gamer, allowing the gamer to roam and change a virtual world at will. In contrast to a progression-style game, a sandbox game emphasizes roaming and allows players to select tasks. Instead of featuring segmented areas or numbered levels, a sandbox game usually occurs in a world to which the game has full access from start to finish. While this kind of definition is true for a more scripted sandbox experience for games such as the Witcher series or Skyrim, I feel like once the decisions are truly up to the player with no scripting or forced morality, we begin to see very different behavior. What I mean by a scripted sandbox is a world in which you are placed with the sole intention of being an amoral hero, but your decisions still ultimately result in bouts of heroism. Because situations like this play heavily off of the idea of that regardless of the choice you make, you will still be lauded as a hero, it is very difficult to describe this as a true sandbox-style game, because although the choices you make are your own, you are still left on one side of a moral compass, so you aren't given the option to help out the villains. In Dungeons & Dragons, there are almost infinite possibilities for you to experience, and so when you are dropped into a world at random with no real directive, the true sandbox, you may find that your players have become murder hobos. For those of you who aren't fully aware as to what this term means, it typically refers to adventurers in most any medium that are technically homeless vagrants, generally living their life on the road while occasionally shacking up at an inn or a tavern. Murder hobos go from village to village, town to town, in pursuit of bigger things to fight and more wealth to acquire. Or think about the player character at the beginning of Skyrim. After you are free from your chains, you can do anything. But for the most part, your early levels will involve wandering around the countryside with a weapon or your magic until fortune smiles upon you. And there is nothing wrong with that kind of mindset. Honestly, in games, I feel like it's entirely up to the player to decide whether or not they want to progress through the story in a conventional way, or if they want to become a huge unarmed lizard man named Gator who hunts down the blacksmiths of the town in a vain attempt to drive up the price of fictional metallurgy, as well as avoid any kind of copyright infringement. However, it is here that we are forced to acknowledge the works of author and researcher Joseph Campbell in his critically acclaimed work, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. In 1,000 Faces, Campbell emphasizes that between the hero and the villain, there is really only one very important distinction to be made. Heroes are reactive, while villains are proactive. Now let that sink in for a moment. Within the first moments of gameplay in an unscripted sandbox environment, your player will usually begin to lean one way or the other. They will either ask themselves who they are, or what their background means in terms of their progression, or they pick a fight with the first guy whose gear looks easy enough to strip off his corpse. Maybe you still have a moral code, and you won't kill every civilian on purpose. But going out bandit hunting still follows the same classical model of what makes a villain. Even though your player can justify their actions, it is in this proactive mindset that we start to see the mustache curls of villainy. That is not to say that everyone who enters into a sandbox will become a villain. Most players prefer to play the part of a protagonist, which is applaudable in its own right. In a sea of chaos, these players do their best to maintain an air of justice by making themselves reactive, which I would argue is different than proactive. It is the difference between acting out of self-interest and you beginning to interject yourself empathetically into the world around you.
Ever play Gwent? Up for a few rounds of Gwent? Wouldn't mind a few rounds of Gwent.
Players suddenly begin to profess a love of nature, order, or even Gwent, and they will latch on to their newfound in-game passion to help build into the world. In my first ever campaign, we were placed into a sandbox with a few hooks that led us into whatever direction we felt coincided with our interests, and I was a good-aligned druid who was a follower of Obed High. Since this was not only the first time I had ever played Dungeons & Dragons, but also the first time I roleplayed with my friends, I was trying to do what I thought was right to be a devout follower to this nature god. I was the newest player at the table, But quickly, I was able to cement myself in this new environment by using a religious structure within the game to align myself to a specific power in the multiverse. I acted in extremes in terms of nature versus civilization and would keep little souvenirs of places that we had been to better remember the times I had with my friends. And up until the time that we all got melted by acid from the mouth of a chimera, I would say it was a really wonderful experience. In my experience as a DM, I have run 2 sandbox-style games like the one I initially played in, a good and an evil campaign that took place within the same world. One of these sessions would actually be my first time performing as a DM for my friends, and I decided that I would offer a sort of scripted open world to help move things along, more along the lines of the Witcher series, in that my players were free to interact with whatever they wanted, magic items were plentiful, and even though I had several plans in motion, my players were the ones who felt like they were in control. But then I got curious. After I started DMing, I wanted to get more experience. So myself and a group of friends decided that we would start a campaign in a sandbox just for fun, and I decided I would let the players be the ones who directed the story entirely, and I would steadily fill out the world map for them as we went along. The players received a magical scroll that would show them whatever their hearts desired: fame, fortune, or the pursuit of fascinations. The group began like any group of murder hobos would, but before long they became, let's say, proactive with their decision-making. Towns that I had created with quaint shops and compassionate innkeepers suddenly found themselves under siege by these players who had already acquired the spoils of adventure. The characters, spawned by my players, soon became slave drivers with gold coins for eyes. It was then that I realized something beautiful. In this situation, this almost entirely proactive game, I now had the chance to create adventuring parties of heroes for these player character villains to fight. I could use the actions of these players to offer insight into the world for new heroes joining the game, and I was able to provide a backstory that I was able to create collectively with my friends. Since beginning the Villains campaign, these players have impacted the world in such a fashion that I could not even possibly comprehend in my own right, and I know that the next group that is run through will certainly have plenty of player-created situations to react to. Alright everybody, that is going to be all the time that we have for today. Thank you for stopping by, and remember, keep your wits sharp and your blades sharper.